May term, term 3 of this academic year, and you have in front of you the syllabus for this term. And if you haven't picked up one from the back table, is there anyone who still needs a copy or so?
I could go get one.
Cindy needs one over here, Bill. Bill?
I need one too.
Does everybody else have a syllabus?
Thank you. Thanks.
This will be the final term of the Academy for this academic year, 2018-19. And we have both the lectures tonight. Next week we have a guest lecture coming in. And then the third week is, of course, reading week. And then we have the fourth week, I'll be lecturing again. And then the final week will be our graduation and potluck dinner. And it's itemized and detailed for you on the syllabus here. This particular term is an extension of the lectures which I gave in the fall, which began sort of our journey thinking about journeying in the faith, and particularly about spirituality. But we barely scratched the surface there. But we had that wonderful book by Oatberg, as you know, that we read for that class. This book that you have in front of you is really an outstanding book, because it not only details the sort of academic didactic part of talking about the spiritual disciplines, but in each chapter it gives you 4 or 5 exercises actually to do to practice what has been talked about in that particular section. So it's not only wonderfully academic, in other words, in the sense of spelling out in a very, very well-written way the spiritual values and the deepening of spirituality, but also it gives you the very practical ways of actually implementing it. So I like that because it's just not all theory, it's theory and practice. So the book is really excellent. It's written by an MD person who's an expert in psychology, but also he has his PhD, and so he straddles between the best of both worlds of the academic life as a PhD and also the practical nature of being a psychiatrist. So he's interested in things of the mind and spirituality, and he's come to believe, as so many have, that as they begin to plumb the depths of the human psyche, they all realize that there's a spiritual dimension in us all. For some it's much more heightened than in others, but in everybody there's a spiritual side of us. And what I often say to my medical students, I say the human body is more than the sum of its parts. In other words, we can account for everything, but there's this spiritual side of human nature that is interesting. We'll be talking about a little bit more about that tonight. To open tonight's session, I would like to call on Father Caney if he would give us a word of invocation and blessing.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Almighty and gracious God, you are the fount of wisdom and the source of all knowledge. We ask that you be present with this gathering through the grace and power of your Holy Spirit, and show us marvelous things according to your will, that we may be deepened in our own life in the Spirit, and that we may imbibe from wisdom coming to us from many sources, but above all for us through your Son, Jesus Christ, in whom is all wisdom and knowledge, sanctification and redemption. For his name's sake we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. Thank you. The place to begin is obviously the most important place to begin, and that is with God himself. And obviously there's the assumption we're making, a positive assumption, that there is a creator of all of heaven and earth, Holy Scriptures, of course, testify to that. The wisdom of the ages underscore it. And those of us who are gathered in this room subscribe to it. That it is not just simply a mechanistic universe that just works in sort of abstract way, but that there is a sort of a controlling influence or initial power that is expressed through creation, and of course the ancients have called that God. And there are several ways of thinking about God, and we've talked about this in other terms, but I think if we start there and then bring it more personally, it's a good way for us to think about what spirituality is really about. So the first thing we sort of think about is that there must have been, at the beginning of time, and if we're thinking about literal time, in other words, where there's a beginning and then a sequence of events, there must have been some initiating cause to start the whole thing in the first place. Now we think that because that is the way we human beings tend to think. In other words, there can't be a watch if there wasn't a watchmaker. In other words, everything that we have a sense of reality must have some sort of creative force or a creator, a watchmaker, if it was the watch, to make that. Now we extrapolate out of our own human experience to think, okay, if that is the way everything is, we don't have a house that just appears out of nowhere. A house has to have a builder. And so we extrapolate out of that kind of human thinking to the origins. And one of the theories, or one of the philosophies of origins, is that of the divine creator. In other words, something that started everything. Because out of our human experience, we know of nothing that exists just automatically without some sort of cause, a causation. And without getting, when I'm teaching at the university, we get into sort of the subtleties of the words and of causation and so forth. But for our purposes tonight, we think of it as an initiatory cause. Something had to start the whole thing in the first place. Now there are some scientific theories out there that there is that creation just simply was. It just is. It was always and will always be. However, our human experience doesn't give us any way to kind of think about that, because our experience tells us that if something exists, it had to be created. So if we start there, we think about a God or a force that has creative abilities. That is, the ability to create out of nothing something. That is the first premise of people who believe in a theistic or a God-oriented philosophy of creation. Now, through human experience, and perhaps maybe because we got it from being children, we sometimes think of God in anthropomorphic ways. That is, we think of God in sort of human terms. So we attribute to God human characteristics. And so our pictures from even in early Sunday school days, or in the early curriculum and so on, pictures God with a beard, an old man because he was there in the beginning. After all, he has to be old if he was there from the beginning. And we tend to make God an image of God from ourselves. In other words, we're kind of creating an image of God based on who we are. And so even the smallest children begin to think of God as being an old man, a male figure. And then later on, even in scriptures and in tradition, we begin to attribute certain adjectives like God the Father. And when we say Father, we begin to think of a human being, a sort of a benign grandfather, somebody that is there and is very caring and watching over us and so forth. So we tend to project out of our experience onto the Creator human characteristics. Now, when we read in Genesis that human beings were made in the image of God, we then make that sort of easy jump to say, well, God, if we're in the image of God, then God has got to look like me. 2 eyes, 2 ears, balding, well, in his case, gray. In other words, we anthropomorphize. We make God into a human being. Now, granted, at this stage, we're just talking about God himself, itself. We're not talking about manifesting in the life of Jesus, which is something different and down the line. But here we're talking about creation itself. And if this creative force, and if we're created in the image of God, then God, and if it has certain characteristics that we have, then we have to identify what characteristics would be noble and valuable that a God would have. And of course, you know, last term, or in the fall term when we talked about this, we sketched out some characteristics which would represent God. In other words, loving, kind, forgiving, all those wonderful adjectives that we attribute to God, adjectives and adverbs. And that's okay, excepting in the Old Testament it says, thou shalt make no image of the Creator. And that's why in certain religions, particularly in Judaism, they have no pictures in their temples of a godlike figure that looks like a human being, because that would be blasphemy. It would be blasphemy to put over the altar a picture of God with a big beard and blazing eyes and balding head and so on, because God is far much greater than any human expression. Now, God can have human kind of characteristics, but those were given to us by the Creator. And so we have to be careful that we don't create God in our image. You see the danger there? And that's why, most likely, the commandment was, you shall make no image of God in heavens or on the earth. And so if we begin there then, God then takes on a kind of different idea. The God who is God of spirit and power, God who knows no limitations and no boundaries. A human being, for example, can't walk in this room and appear. We've just read those lessons, those wonderful lessons about Jesus appearing in the upper room. That's a different thing, because we're now looking at God having divested himself fully into the person of Christ, so that he can walk and maintain his life on earth. That's different. We're talking now about the creative force of the universe. So whatever your picture of God is, it could be a very distant and almost an untouchable, unrelatable force. If I said, as in Star Wars, the Force be with you, that means may God be with you in all of your life. However, how do you picture a force? Or how do you relate to a force? Or how do I, as a human being, have any kind of intersection with a force? And if we're made in the image of God, what does that mean if it doesn't mean that we have hair and eyes and ears and so on? What does image mean? The Imago Dei, the image of God in you. Throughout world religions, the great religions, many of them, and particularly in our Judeo-Christian religion, we believe that that Imago Dei means the Spirit and the power of God dwells within us. Some have described that as the spark of life, that this human being is more than just the sum of its parts, that deep within me I have a soul or a spirit that has been imparted into me by that force of the universe. And that force of the universe then makes me in some ways connected one with the other. So when we, in number one is when we say what and where is God, we can say that God is the creative force of the universe. And although we may attribute human characteristics, we should never fall into the morass or the pit or the abyss to make God in our image. Because the commandment says quite the opposite. You shall not make any image of me. In fact, when Moses, asks at that great scene who God is, or how shall I go to the children of your children down the mountain, and who can I say sent me? God simply says, I am who I am. Actually, in the Hebrew, it's very interesting. It's kind of it's in future tense. That's actually a mistranslation. In the Hebrew, it says, I will be who I will be. That's very interesting. When Moses wants to see what God looks like, God says, you must, hold your hand against, and you can pass by, but you can never look upon me. And so as he sees God, the power of God in the burning bush, in the burning bush. We see God in the cleft of the rock, but you only see the shadow. You only see the kind of mirage that goes by you. You can never look. And therefore, we can never project, draw, create any image of God that isn't in some way a bit blasphemous, because God said, you shall make no images. You shall know not any recognition of me. So now we have God as a spirit and a force. Now where is he? And I'm using, again, here I'm falling into the habit of saying a he. But actually, if God has made man and women in the image of himself, that means there must be both male and female characteristics to God, right? And that ought to make you women feel very good that we, as men, have no exclusivity on God. God has all of human life in his hands. Now, then where is God? Where does God reside? Well, many of the the ancient and primitive people saw things as a sort of three-tiered heaven, water below, the earth, and heavens above. Or you had hell someplace down there, and you had heaven up here. But where is heaven? And where is God? Does God reside out on planet 536 in the Andromeda galaxy? I don't think so. If we could, a spaceport, yes. If we could locate God in any one place, then God couldn't be universally everywhere at the same time. Because one of the things we say about God is that God is universal. God is not confined to time and space. God is beyond time and space. So our linear way of measuring time from this point to that point to this point, in terms of God, is everything is included within God. In other words, there is no time nor space. It is all just amassed in God himself. And so God then can be everywhere, every time, and without limitations. So when we're celebrating the Holy Eucharist, for example, in this parish church, doesn't mean that God has come here, but he can't be at your church at the same time unless you change the hour of your service. In other words, the universality of God, the presence of God, has no limitations. And if that is the case, then everything that is created has a bit of God's touch upon it. Suppose I draw a picture on, and I'm drawing a human being, and the great artist of I am, it looks like that. Now that's not Rembrandt. Might be close, but not Rembrandt. Now the point is that image is part of me because I drew it. If Dr. Ray would come up here and draw a human being over here, Dr. Ray.
I'll climb in here.
Yeah, but this is up to you. You're the creator now.
Oh, yeah.
Uh-oh, okay, orchestrated. A munchkin? Now this guy is really getting into it, isn't he?
A little body to it.
Actually, he's doing a very good job on it.
Then we'll add feet to him. Excuse me here.
Give him some other colors.
Yeah, that's kind of fadey-outy, isn't it, huh?
And we'll put his arms behind his back like over here.
Okay.
And put a little sweater on him. Belly button. A belt. And we give him a athletic shirt.
Okay.
We'll put a big G on it for God.
All right, there you go, there you go. Let's give him an applause, I think. Now, let me see, who wants to buy this painting? Raise your hand. Who wants to buy this painting? What? No takers on my art? Well, the point is that that's Ray. Ray is here because he was the creator. And part of Ray is here. It is not, notice the good grammar here. It is not I, predicate nominative, right? After the form of the verb to be, you have to use the predicate nominative. So I can't say it is me, which would be the accusative case. I say it is I. This is not I, this is Ray, part of Ray. It's created once and for all. And every one of you who would be in this room that would draw something, that would be part of you for all times. For example, next week I couldn't say, oh, this was Marilyn's. No, it wasn't. Marilyn had nothing to do with this. Only Ray had something to do with this. Likewise, only Gary had something to do with this over here. So that when we do something, create, part of ourselves is invested in and for always in that creation. Okay? So that every great work of music by Bach is Bach's alone. Someone can copy him, but it'll never be Bach, right? Because only Bach can do it. When our organist sits down at the great organ here at the church and plays, that sound forever will be a product of her artistry. And although I would sit down and play the same piece, it would never be the same because that was hers, this is mine, right? Likewise with God. When God has created us all, we have then part of the creation within us. And you are unique because God created you by the masterful touch of His creation. And so therefore, when we say, where is God? We can say part of God is in everything. For nothing was made that was not made, right? The Bible tells us. Everything that was created by the Creator Himself and has the remaining touch of the Creator in it. Now, when I was in Germany, I toured the Mercedes-Benz plant in Sindelfingen outside of Stuttgart. And one of the interesting things at the Mercedes-Benz plant was, as you went through the factory, it was quite impressive. Everybody wore white coats working on the assembly line. You thought it was the hospital. And everything's painted white. And it's like an operating theater. And at the end of the line, and when the parts were being, people would sign their name. This engine was built by Albert Schmidt, and signed their name. Why? Because that was their creation. Of course, it carried the name Mercedes-Benz on it, but each part, each unique section of it, was a creation of the Creator. And in like manner, when we say, where is God? We say, right here. In all of us. Part of the creation exists right here, right now. Not limited by time or space. Now, if we then say that we have been created by the Creator, because, as you know, the miracle of birth occurs, but they say that when the child takes its first breath, that slap the little bottom, big bottom now, you know, it's just a product of years. But when that little bottom is stuck, and the baby takes the first inhalation, you know what that means? To inhale or to be inspirited, to get the spirit. Interesting, isn't it? Even the wording. And we talk about that in creation, God blew the breath of life into his creation as God blows the breath of life into each individual. And from that very moment on, we are a unique creation of God, inspirited by or having the breath of God that gave us life. Isn't that interesting? And therefore, the great seers, the great prophets, the great teachers of the world religions have seen in that the fact that God, there's a bit of God dwelling within us. Some call it the divine spark. And that comes from an interesting old rabbinic story. The story goes this way. In the beginning, God was creating all the heavens and earth. And the force of life is light. But there was so much light in the universe that it was too much. And so God had to sort of take the excess light that wasn't used in the creation and put it someplace. And so this old myth says that God took these great jars and put light in these jars to sort of keep it for further creation. But the problem was that light had so much energy and was so much alive that it couldn't contain itself in these containers. And the containers broke into thousands and millions of parts. And those parts came down onto earth, these sparks of light. And you know where those sparks of light are found? In every human being that walks upon the earth. Has the remnants of creation within us. Now, of course, it's an old myth, an old story, but it's a beautiful one because it sort of captures that business of the divine creation coming into human life, either by breath or by the infusing of this Spirit of God within us. Sometimes people will even have said that the soul and the spirit is from God. And the soul and spirit are given to each person individually in the beginning of their life. And that is what we hold and bear. So as we're going down our syllabus here, then the faces of religion are the attempts of human beings to try to understand this miracle of creation. And so for all these different creative forces, Ray, did you want to say something?
Yeah, you're getting to it.
Okay.
Basically, we're talking about this next subject. Is
Right.
Really, we can never totally understand the Creator.
That's right.
It's a wall between us and the Creator because
Right.
it's like, I am the Creator and this is my creation.
Right.
But I can't turn around and say, I understand fully or be one
Right.
with the Creator.
Right.
Because that's impossible.
Right. And
There is a biblical, a sense of biblical theology,
Right.
but you all know where it comes from.
well, the great reason that you can never comprehend fully the Creator is because we are not gods ourselves.
Right.
We may have a part of God within us, but we are not fully God. If we were fully God, we would be co-equal with God, and that cannot be. So the creation, or the created, in this case us, can never be equal to the Creator who makes us. So, but we can know something about the Creator, just as we can know something about our earthly parents, but we don't know everything about them. You know, my mother and my father lived up into their 90s. And the wonderful thing is to be able to know them as an adult. And I was able to find out a lot of things about my parents that I never knew when I was in my 30s and 40s. Now that I'm in my 50s, just testing. But there were many things, and there much that I still did not know, even though they lived into their 90s, about them. But I knew a lot. Meaning that I could never know 100% of my parents, but I could know a lot about them. Likewise, we can never know 100% about God, but we can know a lot about God. Because we see the evidence, the remnants, the remains, and the fact that God, in this infinite, wonderful nature of God, wants to intersect and be part of the creation that He created. You know, it's hard to let go of something you've created. It's hard for parents to finally turn their children loose. Isn't that right? You know, you always want to sort of intercede for, or no, you know a little bit better. Oh, don't do that. I'll make the decision for you. Oh, don't do that. I'll choose. No, don't do. You really want this. There's a wonderful little story too about a little girl sitting with her parents, and they're in a restaurant, and the waitress comes over and she's taking the orders, and the little girl, she turns to the little girl, she says, "What would you like?" She said, "I'd love a hot dog with ketchup on it." To which the mother spoke up, "Oh, no, Mary, you don't want that. Bring her chicken parm." The waitress never bats an eye. She says, "And what else would you like on your hot dog?" And she said, "Could I have onions, please?" And she said, "Yes." Her mother said, "Mary, you don't want a hot dog. You want chicken parm." To which the waitress turns on her heels and goes to the kitchen and brings her hot dog. Now, the mother obviously was thinking, well, you know, the hot dog has got too much sodium in it. It's not really healthy, and here we are in a nice restaurant. Why doesn't she want a good chicken parm? But in respect to the little child, she knew what she wanted, and the waitress was smart enough to listen to her. I suppose she didn't get a good tip that day, because Mary wasn't tipping, but the mother and father were. But that
possibly a lawsuit to the restaurant.
But the point is that that was a respect of the will of the little child, much like in drawing the conclusion that God, although wants an intimate relationship with us, doesn't want to control us, much as if you have to know when to let go. So the faces of religion what separates one religion from another are the attempts, the human attempts, to try to discover the wonders of God and make them accessible and understandable to the people that follow their way. Now, obviously, Jesus was the great interpreter. But those in the Eastern religion who follow Buddha or Confucius or Zhao Lao, are following other kinds of gurus and experts and so on that are trying to lead people into a certain reality of the divine. The problem with a lot of religion is that we sometimes make it an experience of the head rather than the heart. And I certainly don't criticize that because, ultimately, because I've made most of my career of the wonders of the mind, studying at the great universities. I still am an avid reader and a student. I'm still learning from the Torah and the writings of religion. And certainly that has an important place as you begin to interpret the wisdom of the ages. But other people have found that sometimes religion becomes sterile. It becomes routine, or it becomes so ritualistic. And I'm not criticizing ritual at all, because we'll talk about the importance of ritual. But patterns can be developed so that you so-called get nothing out of it. Meaning that you can go to a so-called religious environment and come away as dead from it as you went and entered into it. In other words, you are there mentally and rationally, but you haven't connected with God that is much more mystical, mysterious, and unknown. Sometimes the greatest experiences we come, and the mystics, which I have at the bottom of the page, the mystics were ones that says true religion is both and. It's both the routine that we get into, but it's much more than that. It is allowing the heart to be opened and the Spirit of God to come forth, that spark within us. Or, to put it in other words, it's the spirituality, developing the spiritual side of our nature, beside just the mental, rational part of our nature. And it's in that spiritual place in which we connect with God. So, there's numerous ways of expression that the mystics, or those people who saw in religion the need for much more than just head knowledge. You've heard me say before that I can train my students to recite the Apostles' Creed. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and so forth and so on, and they don't believe one word of it. It's just rote. It's blah, 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 blah. It doesn't need to be that way. But what I'm saying is, you can have a disconnect between your rational, mental, rational side from the spiritual, softer, connected side of God. So that sometimes you can spend an entire 30 years in religious practice and never feel that you're close to God. Or you don't have the experiences that other people have who've experienced God in a much more personal way. You know, most of you have probably heard from friends, family members, and others where they go through some experience in their life and they'll, you know, in the quiet of sitting in front of a fireplace on a cold wintry night, or when you're having a nice meal with somebody, and they'll say, you know, I'm going to tell you something. And you think, oh boy, now what? You know, did she get a divorce this week? Or, you know, did the daughter run off with the nice boyfriend? And they said, no, I want to tell you something. Now, I know you're not going to believe this, right? That's the way it always starts. I know you're not going to believe this. Or people tell me, they'll say, now, Pastor, I know you're going to laugh at this, but I've got to tell you this experience I had, right? That's what they always start that way. And what that generally means is it's telling about an experience, an encounter with God. The time, for example, that someone goes into surgery and they're on the, they're being prepped for the surgery, and the surgeon says to them, you don't seem a bit nervous. And the woman replies, doctor, you're not going to believe this, but an angel appeared to me last night in my room and said, Ruth, you're going to be okay. Or someone will say, I saw the hand of Jesus take me in hand and said, don't worry about it, Ralph. You and I will walk through this experience together. And they'll say, now I know you're not going to believe this, but it happened. Now what happened there? Was that just simply a figment of somebody's imagination? Was it something just somebody wanted to impress you about their religion? No, I don't think so. When people sit down in those quieter moments and connect with you personally and say, I wouldn't tell everybody about this because I know they'll laugh and think that there's, but I want to tell you as my best friend how my life was changed. And you'll never believe it. Right? And those are always the words. Never believe it. Why? Because it defies our human, rational, mental ways of thinking about how religion works. We want things very predictable, you know, how it's always this way and so forth. But when you think about it, religion at its deepest and its best is a vehicle which draws us closer to the heart of God. That's its sole purpose. It's the purpose of our faith, of our rituals, of our worship, is to have an encounter with God. And to begin to touch within our souls, within our inner self, that spark of heaven, which, whether you believe or not, came down as part of light. Or, as this is part of Ray in here, just as God is part of Gary in here, and Father Caney is in there, and Pastor Bill is in there, and God is in there. Because we're His creation. And it was God who breathed the first breath into our lives. So when you ask where God is, we don't think of God someplace on planet 756 of the Andromeda galaxy, way out there someplace. We think of God, no, intimately connected with His creation. Now some people, you can call this pantheism, which is kind of an official title, where you see God in everything. In other words, God is in the animal. Well, actually, I've been taking care of 5 cats. Not my own, but my neighbors. Minnie, Millie, Mia, Mickey, and Little Lamb. Okay, those 5 M's. And every time that they go away, I get, would you mind taking care of her? Oh, of course not. Being the good neighbor that I am. But I have found the cats fabulously interesting because Little M has taken a liking to me. And now when I come home at night, Little M runs over and she has a funny way of walking through my legs to trip me. Have you ever noticed how a cat will do that? If you're walking straight ahead, she walks right in front of it, right? Or if I pause, she rides between my legs, you know. So I look like the drunken sailor coming in at night, trying to avoid Little M. But I began to realize that there's something there more than just an abstract animal. Because feeding them, of course, you know, you don't bite the hand that feeds you. But nonetheless, and maybe it's my imagination, and you won't believe this. But when I say hi to Little M, she'll go, meow. Now, was that a flea that bit her?
No.
I don't know. But in some ways, she looks up at me, so endearing, and when I say, hi, Little M, and she hasn't spoken before. I mean, she's been silent when she's been going through my legs, and then I bend over and say, how are you, Little M? And she'll say, meow. Now, I just wonder whether that is not a sign of recognition. And something within that little creature that we think is lesser than human life, but that, are they touched also by the hand of God, creation? I think so. If you've ever talked to people who have deep relationship with their animals, a dog, a cat, they can go into as much mourning at the death of a cat or a dog, and some of you sitting at this table I know because I've done blessing services for your animals. They have become part of your family, intricately related, not as a son or daughter, but as an integral part of that family. When my mother died, Megan, the dog next door that I shared equally with my neighbors, another M you notice, Megan. But when my mother died, Megan cried at the door the day that she died, and I went home. She came over and she kept crying at the door. I opened the door, she went to my mother's chair, she looked at my mother's chair, and then she came over and sat right by my feet, but not right by my feet, right on my feet. and pressed against me like this with her body, just like this, as close as she could, just leaning on me like that. I said, Megan. And that entire night, she never left my side. Now, did she know something? Of course. You'll never believe it. But I think there was something there. And perhaps that something was a sense of feeling, emotion. Have you ever seen a dog smile?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Megan would do that. I'd say, Megan, you're the prettiest dog in the world. And she'd go like that. I know, Megan, I know. So when we think about the omnipresence, the eternal presence, the all-present nature of God is in perhaps things that we never thought God's touch was in. All creatures, great and small, God made them all, right? And so pantheism was a sort of a catchword that says God's presence is seen in everything in creation. In a tree, in a flower, in a goldfish, even in a snake, I guess. But whatever it is, God's presence abides. Notice, we've taken God out of being out there someplace far away to bringing God to be intimately involved and interactive in the creation itself. So that what many mystics have found, and others who have seen the more spiritual side of God, is to begin to understand that God is not out there, but God is here. And God is really present. And one of the miracles of Christianity is to really bring God in the flesh in this wonderful presence of Jesus, so that he is both human and divine. God in human life and form. Now, then, if this is the case, that God is very near and not far away or removed, that God is as close as in my heart and in my soul, for what is soul, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, then isn't it possible, as the mystics and the other great philosophers and teachers have thought, that if God is that close, and that God and I have always been in intimate relationship even before my birth, for even Psalm 139 says, even in your mother's womb I knew you, and I called you by name. Or as it further says in Psalm 139, if you go to the farthest hills, the farthest distances, the highest mountains, the far and distant shores, I'm there. If you go to the depths of the ocean, oh Lord, you're there too. For there's nowhere I can go that your loving presence is not. And there it is, that God is in our midst, right now, right in this place, right as near as the beating of your heart. And if that is the case, the mystics then tell us, the spiritual divines of the ancients would say, then it's only a matter of knowing how to get in touch. Right? And at those moments, which are kind of aha moments, or when you say, I know you're never going to believe this, but let me tell you, those are the moments in which the divine became real to you in a unique time and place. But the mystics would say, that is, the people who want to go deeper into religion and deeper into the experience of God would say, then why can't we have those experiences more often? And what's limiting us from feeling that divine presence of God every day in so many ways? Is it that we just simply aren't attuned to seeing God's hand at work? If we really do subscribe, and you know we do, to say God's hand looks after me, God is watching over me day by day, then wouldn't it be nice to be able to see the evidences of God more often in life than we do? And that rather than go through only a few times in life that we can really point to the fact that God had intersected in my life, we could point to many. and we begin to look with a new way, a new vision, new eyes to see. And maybe this is what God was saying in Jesus when he said, those who have eyes to see, let them see. Those who have ears, let them hear. Maybe we just need to sharpen our attunement. You know, I often say to our congregation, you know, the miracle is that WKBN, WFMJ, 33 are in this room right now. We can't see it. We can't see Tom Guthrie or the weatherman or anybody. But if I had a television set and I tuned it to the right channel, all of a sudden, bingo, there's 21 and 33 and 27, depending on which channel I put it on. What's the difference between here, can't see it, and having a television set to tune it in? What's the difference? I've learned how to receive the signals that I cannot see otherwise. And the great spiritual teachers of the ages have said, you see, it's only a matter of learning how to tune in to God. And with that, we'll take our break.
Boy, you must have hit everybody. They're all quiet.
I know. Good.
That was very good.
Thank you.